Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to see you all here. This is something I've been wanting to do. So my name's Trent Bristol. I'm the city arborist. And I started here about 3 years ago in December. And this is something I've kind of been wanting to do for a long time. And so I appreciate our communications department helping me, helping us get this going. So I'm really happy to see everybody here. I've got Scott Zeidler with me today from the Utah State Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just basic tree care, and then I've got Scott on tap to talk a little bit about some common diseases and insects that you might encounter. So I've been talking to third graders all week, so we'll see if I can shift gears. If it seems like I'm talking to the wrong audience, just say, hey. So anyway, so like I said, I've been talking, 70 third graders without a microphone, and now I'm talking to adults with a microphone. So if my volume is off or whatever, I'm too loud, just let me know. Anyway, okay, so we'll just jump right in. Which way? Oh, there we go. So this is kind of what I want to cover today. Which tree species do we want to select? Selecting the tree itself, some specific characteristics, proper planting techniques, and then new tree care. I gotta make sure it seems backwards to click the right arrow to go forward when I'm I don't know, anyway. We'll try and keep everything going forward. So we want to talk about planting the right tree in the right place. Tree selection is very important. Come on in. So I've got on the table a list of our city's tree care, approved tree species. And a disclaimer, I wasn't really sure how many people to expect. I only printed 20 copies, but it is available on our city website. So if you just go to herriman.org/trees, you can find the tree list there. This list is fairly specific to park strips. So, in your own property, you can plant whatever you want to a certain extent. There are some prohibited tree species on there. Most of the ones that are in the prohibited list are actually there because we don't want them in the park strips, but there are a couple that are invasive, like Russian olive and salt cedar. We'd rather not see people plant those in their yards either, but we don't have any kind of an ordinance for that. But specifically, these trees were selected for park strips, so you can plant kind of whatever you want, but know that the species we've got on the list, most of those we've tested, and they do fairly well. There's a list of smaller trees for 3 to 5 foot park strips and larger trees for 6 to 10 foot park strips. So there are some things, so we've taken flowering pear off of the approved list, and this is why. This is the fate of most of our flowering pears after about 20 years. They have terrible branch angle, and when they get heavy, those branches just shear off and it takes half the tree, and I always end up cleaning up about 10 of these every year when we have a big windstorm. So people always want to know, well, how come you took flowering pear off the list? Because they grow so well here. Well, they do until they're about 20 years old, and then they look like that. So ash species we've also taken off the list just because of the impending threat of emerald ash borer, as well as some native borers that cause us a lot of problems with ash trees. But so there are some species we definitely would prefer to see people avoid. But we've got a pretty good list of a wide variety of trees, and then we're always open to trying new things too if somebody wants to take a risk. Think about your tree size. Not the size when you buy it, but think about what it's going to look like when it's mature. How much space do you have above ground? How much root space do you have? Street and sidewalk clearance. So I had somebody call me up. So we provide a pruning service where we'll make sure that we get the 13.5 foot clearance over the street and 7 foot clearance over the sidewalks. Typically, I do that in conjunction with our streets crew, where they'll get a bunch of streets that they're going to resurface, and they give me the map of those streets, and I go out and I prune on those streets. I've had people tell me, well, these trees don't need pruning, they're dwarf trees. And the problem is, well, I'll show you a picture here in a minute, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be an ideal situation for a street tree. And then various tree characteristics, think about what you're interested in. I put a link up here. It's also on our list of trees to the Utah State University tree browser. You can pull up any one of those trees and you can look at pictures of it. It'll show you what the leaves look like. It'll show you fall color. It'll show you flowers, bark characteristics, all kinds of cool stuff. So that really helps you kind of determine what sort of tree you want. Again, okay, so this is what I was talking about with dwarf trees. We've got to maintain that 13.5-foot clearance, but if the tree only grows 10 feet tall and 10 feet wide, it makes it really hard to get that clearance and keep that tree healthy and happy. Free trees on the fence line, not always a great idea, you know. This individual let their Siberian elm just grow up along the fence line. They're like, free trees. And then when she needed to replace the fence, that becomes a real problem. Think about the root system. This is a mulberry tree, and as you can see, it has a fairly aggressive root system, fairly shallow, and you can see that every time she mows, she's cutting off the top of that big root. So think about what you're willing to tolerate. Think about the space you've got for roots. Think about the space you've got above ground. So this was actually a really cool, this guy he's got a ginkgo planted in an atrium in his living room. Ginkgo can get to be a very large tree, but so what that requires is pruning every year to keep it to a certain size. This was a pine tree that was planted at Old City Hall, and I was actually kind of glad that it died. You won't hear me say that very often, but if you look at where it was planted and how much space it had between there and the roof, you know, at some point that tree was going to be 25 feet wide, and it was planted 3 feet from the building. So those are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about when you're planting your tree, and thinking about what is that tree going to look like when it's grown. There's a variety of different ways that you can purchase trees. So you can buy containerized trees, which is probably mostly what you're going to see. It comes in these little black pots. The pros are they're pretty easy to plant. They're pretty readily available. They're fairly affordable. The cons are they can become easily root bound. And what I mean by, back up. What I mean by that, you can see how all the roots are just kind of growing around the outside edge of that pot. And if you leave that, if you don't do anything with that, those roots will continue to grow in a circle, and as they get bigger, they'll eventually choke and kill that tree. So, you know, if you don't plant it properly, and it probably will live this year, it'll probably live next year. It might be 10 years down the road, it might be 20 years down the road, and all of a sudden this tree dies, and you go, what happened? Well, you pretty much have to dig it up, look at the root system, and see, okay, well, yeah, it killed itself because those roots were girdling the tree. Let me back up. So, and almost every tree that you buy containerized is going to look just like that. So if you do get those, I've been reading some different research, and they say the best way to handle that is to take a sharp shovel or a saw and just kind of shave the outside edge. I've seen where people will take a knife and slit down 4 sides of the root ball, but they're saying they actually get better results by just shaving that with a really sharp shovel or a sharp saw.
Trent?
Yeah.
Do you cut off the bottom too, or just the side?
Yeah, it's a good idea to do the bottom, and it's a good idea to look at it first, you know, because you'll know when you look at it, you'll see if those roots are all bound up on the bottom, or sometimes they just kind of hang down and they're not really wadded up down there, but if they are, definitely cut those off.
So I just broke mine up so it's loose of all that dirt. The roots are hanging free, and then put the dirt in.
And that's a way to do it too. But what they found is, and especially depending on the species, some species will handle that, some won't. So they found that the best overall situation is actually to shave those. But that is one of the methods that they looked at, and some of the trees did really well. But overall, they found that they all did better by shaving them. So. Oh, I did it again. So ball and burlap is another way you can buy trees. They tend to be really expensive this way. They tend to be really heavy. And there's a lot of material that you have to remove, because you got to remove that burlap, and you have to remove at least the top 2/3 of that wire cage. And I found it's really difficult to get the burlap off without tearing off the wire cage and without tearing apart the root ball. So if those root balls fall apart, it can be really hard for those trees to establish. So you almost have to have equipment to plant ball and burlap. Typically, they're going to be 200 or 300 pounds apiece. So you can do it by hand. I've done it by hand. I prefer not to. And then bare root is the third way that you can purchase trees. One of the benefits to this, they're super light. You can carry 2 or 3 trees by yourself. You don't have to worry about that too much. You can get a wide variety of species through bare roots. One of the downsides is you typically have to buy them in bulk. You usually have to buy large numbers of them. They can be a little bit hard to find, hard to track down. And you also have to take really good care of them. There's some special care that you have to do. You can't let the roots dry out at all. So what you see up here, this is actually a little gravel bed nursery that we put together here in the city a couple of years ago. So what I typically do, I'll buy 75 or 80 bare root trees, and I'll stick them in that gravel bed and just let them sit there over the summer. So when they go in, and you can't really see very well, but this is kind of what the roots look like when they go in, and this is what they look like when they come out. So they have a really well-established root system, but it can be a little bit tricky to get them planted properly. So when you're looking to select a tree, obviously you want to look for any damage, you want to look for any insects and disease, you want to look for a good form. That single leader is super critical. Just having that one main leader is probably the best thing that you can look for in most tree species. Look at the branch angles. Typically somewhere between 45 and 90 degrees is going to be a really good branch angle. If it's really tight, that's when I showed you the flowering pear, that's typically what happens is those branch angles are too tight, and then as they start growing together, it's a weak connection, and one of those branches will just rip off. So that 45 to 90 degree angle is a pretty good angle. You want to look for good spacing, and some of this can be dealt with through pruning too. If you pick up a tree and it doesn't have a really good form, you can do a little bit of pruning on it to clean that up before you put it in the ground, or shortly after if it's not too tall. Proper depth. This one is a little bit hard to see. Probably 80% of the trees that I see dead in the city were planted too deep. That's the number one issue that I see all the time. And when you plant the tree, you want to actually kind of excavate it down a little bit until you find those first roots. A lot of times, even coming from the nursery, it's going to have a little bit of extra soil up on top, and you want to just scrape that away until you can find the roots. This tree, I put the base of the tape right about where those roots were. Some of them are obviously kind of piled up against the tree, but from where those first roots were coming out to where the soil level was, it was 4 inches too deep. So, and you can see, well, you can't see it, but I dug that out with a shovel. It was dead, and those roots they didn't expand at all. They couldn't get any oxygen, so that tree just died. Mulch volcanoes are a big no-no. Mulch is great. Mulch helps keep the grass away. It helps keep the lawnmowers back away from your tree. It helps keep the weeds down. It keeps moisture in the soil. It kind of keeps the soil temperatures cool. Does a lot of really great things. But if you pile it up too high, it'll rot the bark on the base of your tree. So you want it about 3 inches deep. You want it a little bit away from the very base of the tree. And something else. Oh, yeah. If you get it too deep, it can be rodent habitat. So the little buggers will get in there and chew the bark off your tree. So you don't want that. But about 3 inches is usually pretty much ideal. So in new tree maintenance, they used to always say, well, you want to prune a bunch of branches back so that the roots don't have to support all those branches. That's not really true. The only reason that you want to prune a new tree is just to get that form that I was talking about, to have that nice, solid single leader. And if you've got, if your branches are poorly spaced and you want to space them out a little bit, or you've got a little bit of dead branch or something, that's really the only reason you would want to prune a new tree. Fertilizer, trees are actually really good at taking up nitrogen. They're really good at taking up phosphorus. Very, very rarely recommend fertilizing a new tree when you plant it. The only exception to that is if you've tested your soil and there's something specifically lacking in your soil and you know that it's lacking, then you might want to add that to your tree. But typically for a brand new tree, I definitely don't recommend fertilizer. Yes?
If a new tree is just like the first year?
Yeah, first year. And honestly, unless the tree is struggling, I generally don't recommend fertilizer for trees at all. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with ANSI standards, American National Standards Institute, but the ANSI 300 basically covers standards for tree care, tree planting, and they generally don't recommend fertilizing trees. ISA generally doesn't recommend fertilizing trees unless you notice something specific. That's, if you see some symptoms that your tree is not doing well, first thing to do is check your soil, have it tested. You can send that off to Utah State for a fee, and they'll test it and tell you what's in it, what's not in it. And then, kind of go from there. But generally, I don't recommend fertilizing trees as a regular practice. Okay, water. So a question came up earlier before we got started about trees and grass. So most of our trees in our parks, in our homes, in our lawns, whatever, they're surrounded by grass. We plant our trees right into the grass. And that's not ideal. I mean, that's reality. But grass wants to be watered regularly. Grass wants to be watered a couple of times a week, 3-4 times a week, whatever. Trees actually do better if you water them deep and let them go. So once a week, maybe twice a week. Water them deep, let the soil drain. Water them deep, let the soil drain. So deep and infrequent is what trees prefer. So occasionally you'll find, you'll see that trees and grass can coexist, but they both do better in separate watering zones. So, don't overwater your tree. So we talked a little bit about that before we got started too. I couldn't remember if I'd mentioned that in here. But you definitely can overwater your tree. Roots have got to have oxygen just like anything else, and if your soil stays perpetually saturated, your roots won't get any oxygen and they'll just rot. So the symptoms of overwatering look very much like the symptoms of underwatering. So if your tree looks like it's drying up and wilting or whatever, look at your watering system and see if you're putting too much or not enough, because they look very similar. And then pests. People, a lot of times they'll see their trees not looking good, and the first question is, what do I spray it with? Well, I'm going to let Scott talk a little bit more about that. But don't spray your tree with anything unless you've identified a specific issue. If there's not a specific pest that's in your tree or in the area threatening your tree, don't spray for that pest, because you're not doing yourself any good. So just as a quick wrap up, choose an appropriate species, choose well-formed trees, proper planting procedures, and then good follow-up on your tree. Any questions before we turn it over to Scott? Yeah.
I put flowering pears in that bark strip 18 years ago, and only the last few years I'm starting to get roots coming up. Trees come up from the roots. How do I fix that?
Well, the way we handle it in the city is we just go out with a pair of loppers and trim them back. There are some growth hormones that you can put on that will slow some of that down. Typically, that's a stress response. So if the tree becomes stressed, it's going to start sprouting from the base. So it may be just that the last 2 summers we've had were just hot and brutal. We've seen a lot of stress response in a lot of trees across the city.
Yeah, 'cause it's only been recently.
Yeah. Well, and even, our evergreens, kind of the same thing. A lot of winter stress that we've seen over the last couple of years because we just haven't had enough snow to keep moisture in the ground through the winter time. So, yeah.
So you mentioned the difficulty of coexisting with lawns and grass and all of that, and so if you've got trees, if you've got new trees that you've planted in a parking strip, and it has a watering system there, how do you manage that?
That's an excellent question. That's something I struggle with every day. So,
How do you have that grass survive, and then how do you have the tree?
you just kind of have to play around with some different things, and it may be that your tree just has to survive on the water that your grass gets, or, if you find that your grass is getting lots of water, what I would actually recommend is if you can get a moisture probe, just push it down into the soil 24 inches or whatever, see if that moisture is getting down into that 24-inch zone. If your moisture is only grassroots level, then your grass is doing great, your tree might not be. If that moisture is penetrating down to where the tree roots are, you're probably okay. If it's not, you might want to just go out with a hose and maybe add a little bit of extra water to the tree once a week. That's kind of my best answer. Yeah?
It seems like a lot of old pine trees are dying, or pine trees in general around here. Is there a reason for that in your word?
There's a couple of things. And I don't want to take too much of Scott's thunder, but there's a black pine scale that's part of the problem, and another part of the problem is just these last couple of winters that we haven't had any snow. Conifers stay green all year, and so even after they've gone dormant, they still continue to lose water through the wintertime because their needles are still green. So they'll pull water up from the soil and lose it through their needles. If we don't have snow on the ground and there's not moisture in the ground, then those trees are going to start to exhibit signs of burning through the wintertime. So if you don't have snow on the ground, it's generally a good idea to go out in the wintertime, if you've got a way to do it, and just water those conifers once a month. Give them a good deep watering once a month through the wintertime, which is hard to do if you're worried about, water systems freezing, but that's a good way to take care of your conifers. Yeah?
What did Herriman adopt as a fair policy? And I assume all the existing ones are grandfathered.
Yeah, they're we're not going around taking out pears. As they fall apart like that, I take them out and replace them with something else. And I don't know, it was in place when I started here 3 years ago. So I don't know, it might have been, I think our landscape architect was maybe instrumental in that.
It was probably just months before you come on board, Trent.
Okay.
So it wasn't very long.
Right. Okay. So yeah, and so the other thing is we want a diverse population of trees. If we do happen to get a pest like emerald ash borer that takes out all ash trees, obviously we don't want a whole bunch of ash trees out there. We want a wide variety of species so that we don't wipe out a huge percentage of our tree population. I've got an inventory of 20,000 trees in the city of Herriman, and we're at 47% flowering pear. So that's huge. We typically don't want more than 10% of a specific species.
What can we add to our soil? Our soil sucks, is when that's what What can we add when we're planting trees and wood shrubs?
Sure.
Help that soil.
So soil amendments it's really a Band-Aid. Soil, and I can't remember what the term, Scott, can you remember what the term is where soil, you can only amend it so far and it kind of works its way back to what its original properties are? Yeah, I can't remember the term, but yeah, I can't remember. But there are things that you can do to address those types of issues, but the soil will only be amended so much, and it's eventually going to work its way back to its original condition. So, if you're trying to change the pH of the soil, you can change it a little bit for a short time, but it's going to keep wanting to go back to its original pH. So if you've got iron chlorosis in your trees, you can add iron chelate, and that'll extend the life of your tree a little bit, but it's really just a Band-Aid approach.
What 2 to 3 trees do you suggest we plant here that will thrive?
Well, I don't recommend 2 to 3 trees. I recommend 25 trees. As many different species as we can get. Yeah, and there's quite a few on our list, so. Yes?
We've got a maple, an autumn blaze maple, and I see them all over the city.
Uh-huh.
They look horrible. apply.
Yeah.
Right, 1st of July.
You'll notice they're not on our approved list.
And why are they out of the city?
Well, again, the approved list, actually, that was something that we finalized my first year here 3 years ago. So, but people love autumn blaze maple because they have such amazing fall color, but you'll never see it here in Herriman. Because, like you say, by the 1st of July, they're all burned, and you never get that color out of them. And that's another one that's really, really sensitive to that iron chlorosis. So the best thing I can recommend is not to plant autumn blaze maple. So, I know it. Yes.
So I really like the look of the flowering pear. Can you suggest a tree that grows slower like that tree and not any bigger?
Well, it kind of,
Trip on straight lines.
it depends on what it is about it that you like the look of.
I like the shape of it. I like that it doesn't get huge.
Uh-huh.
And I like the height. I'm trying to find trees for park strip that won't block the views.
Okay,
Because we have beautiful views.
sure.
So I like a full tree. I like one, I just like that tree. So
Sure.
find something that's kind of shaped like that doesn't get crazy tall.
So I've been using Japanese lilac as a replacement for flowering pear. It doesn't really have exactly the same shape, but it does have the nice white blossoms in the early summer, and it doesn't get ridiculously huge. So,
And then one more question.
Sure.
Because we're up towards the mountain. What tree do deer eat most? What kind of tree do deer going to stay away from on the street? We have them in our backyard all the time.
let me back up a little bit and I'll show it. So I've actually started putting I'm putting tubes around the base of them, because what I find even more often than deer chewing on them is they rub on them. And they just tear all that bark off. So I've been buying, it's called Tree Pro, it's a tree protector, and it's kind of a specialized deal. You can get them from forestry suppliers, or some people will just take corrugated pipe and split it down the side and cut it off and just wrap it around the base of the tree. And that'll keep the deer from rubbing on it. If you've got problems with deer chewing on it, there's a variety of different things you can use. You can use like deodorant soap. They tend to be turned off by that. There's a product called Plant Skid, which is like blood and bone meal, and it comes in a spray, and you can spray the tree, and it has a scent to it that the deer will stay away from, and probably your children and your neighbors will stay away from it too. and you may not get to use your sprayer again afterwards. So it does have a tendency to kind of plug up the sprayer. But yeah, as far as yeah, I haven't really found anything that the deer will truly leave alone, especially for that rubbing. And it's just kind of random, you know. I've got a tree right here on Butterfield Parkway, and I planted it a couple years ago, and I came out last year, and they'd rubbed it all dead. And some of the parks, you know, they'll rub one and they'll leave three, and so I don't know how they just select that.
And you can see that happening up through the neighborhood.
Right.
I don't know what they're special, but some of them, they just really like to rub on, and others they
Right. Well, I want to make sure I give Scott plenty of time. I'll take one more question.
Any problem with using the hose water that's soft water?
Is it culinary or is it secondary?
Culinary, but it runs through the soft water system, which is a salt system.
Sure. Honestly, I don't know. I can't say that I've ever really come across that before, but it's got to be better than the secondary. I don't know. Have you tested the salinity as it's coming out of the...
I haven't.
Okay. Because my guess is it probably...
People say they taste the salt, but I don't taste it.
Yeah, I know I've had soft water systems, but...
Having just installed one myself, because I had to do a bunch of research, I can tell you right now, and she probably heard an earful of me talking about salt water or soft water systems. The only time that you should never taste salt water, that means you've got your salt turned up too high. And we have extremely hard water in Herriman, so getting it to the right, you basically are wanting to zero it out, not overboard.
Sure.
And the water that comes out that's treated, that's gone through the soft water system, should not affect anything. The only problem is
it's demineralized. So
Oh, okay.
minerals that might be essential to the tree.
Could be, or it actually could be that, I mean, most of the water that we're using, even our culinary water, has a tendency to be pretty alkali, and trees love acidic soil. So that's one of the reasons we're limited on tree species, because trees prefer more that is very alkali as well. So maybe, I don't know for sure, but maybe demineralizing it might actually help.
Test strips, that's
Yeah.
cheap for $10.
Sure.
You can test your water and get it to 0, so you don't have salt in it.
Okay, yeah, so that might be something for me to take a look at. I'm now you got me interested, so I'll have to see what I can come up with. But like I say, I want to make sure that Scott's got plenty of time, so I'm going to turn it over to him, and I'll be around for questions. I don't. Scott and I maybe Scott might be able to stay around a little bit too for questions. So you probably want a mic, don't you?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
Hey, thanks. It's nice to be with you this evening. I really didn't expect this many people to come out, but as Anthony mentioned, there were several requests over the years to host something like this, and I compliment the city for bringing you all together in the venue and opportunity to talk about nerdy stuff like trees. I'm a tree nerd. I've been at it for a while, about 30 years. I did about 13 years of my career working at the entrance to Utah State Prison. There was a conservation nursery, so we grew shrubs, trees, grasses, wetland plants for mostly kind of traditional forestry and rangeland management, mine reclamation. And I sympathize with some of the growing conditions that you face here in Herriman. We were a windy site in Draper. We had warm winter winds preceding the winter storms that would come in, so this warm south wind, and then the temperature would drastically fall. We had alkaline soils, which are very common to, I think, the entire middle portion and eastern portion of the city. And we had deer. and there were some trees that we grew that were well acclimated for those site conditions, but there were several that we tried and did struggle to grow that weren't just conducive to the soil, the climate, the heat, the wind that we all face as property owners and, landscapers, because we have a nice yards around us, and so there are some challenges. And all the advice that you were given by Trent is sound. There are some pamphlets that I brought with me, and you're welcome to take whatever titles interest you. Trent touched on several of those: young tree planting, young tree pruning. So if you want to take some material home with you or for your neighbors, you're welcome to take the handouts with you. I thought I would talk about recurring insects and diseases of ornamental trees that I hear or have reported or have looked at here in Salt Lake County. And they're commonly talked about. Have any of you, raise a hand, I always like this, listen to the KSL Greenhouse Show on Saturday morning. Hey, we got some fans. That's the second longest running radio talk show in U.S. after Music and the Spoken Word, which is another KSL deal. So we have some people that are very interested, and they often ask the same kind of questions that you ask, and they have the same interests and passions that you have too. So I hear on the radio show these things, so I thought I'd talk about those. Let's see. So I have to give you this background. So I work for the State Forester's Office, which is Department of Natural Resources, a state of Utah agency. And we get our funding largely to interact with cities, mostly city governments, city arborists, tree boards, on its special occasions, city councils for subject matter. And we are funded through the USDA Forest Service, which is a management agency that that oversees and administers a lot of the mountains you now see covered with snow. We do it under authority called state and private forestry. So I have to give a shout out to our funding mechanisms and the agency that I work at. And today we are really, my subject matter is focused on plant health care. All these pamphlets that I brought with me are all listed in the titles up there. And I'm going to be talking about a lot of the subjects in the plant health care that I've circled. And these are all summaries of best available science. Now, will science change in 10, 20 years? Yes. The things that we think are the best things to do right now might not be the best things in 20 years. But we're all learning together. There's research, applied research, and there's peer-reviewed research that ends up as best practices. And all those pamphlets there are derived from best practice, all their content. And our professional organization that we subscribe to as certified arborists is the International Society of Arboriculture. And they have a website, treesaregood.org, so you can visit that or encourage your neighbors, friends, relatives to visit that website. If you want to take pictures of these slides, feel free. If you want to get the web address or the list, feel free to do that. I always take pictures of other professional slides because I think they're awesome and I need to go back and learn. So you're welcome to do that. So trees don't tell you too early that they're suffering. It's usually the appearance of the foliage that directs our attention. And we're very good at pattern recognition as humans. We can see something looks a little off or a little out of place. So that's that very strong nature that we have to say, hey, something's wrong with my tree, my grass, my shrubs, my foundation on my house, my fence, right? And it's recognizing abnormalities, things that seem out of place. And for trees, it's usually the foliage that is the first sign. And you'll compare your foliage of your tree to your neighbor's tree, or two trees of the same species, but one seems to be struggling and one appears to be normal. And so it invites diagnosis or closer examination, and also a theory that we hypothesize, there's something wrong with my tree, I need to fix it, right? And sometimes they're fixable, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're misdiagnosed. Sometimes you may have a diagnosis and it may be the wrong thing if it's an inexperienced arborist that's leading you. But nonetheless, trees are puzzles. And it's hard, you kind of have to take apart the pieces in your mind and formulate what you think or hypothesize. In this particular frame or picture, it's a blue spruce. In the background over Colleen's head, you can see a blue spruce that has fading or color-changing conifer needles, right? You had mentioned the conifers seem to be stressed here in Herriman. Well, they're stressed up at this particular mountain, and these are landscape planted blue spruce. They're not native blue spruce, but they're close to the cabins, and there's concern for that. There are entomologists whose job is to specifically know the insects that affect plants. And there's tree entomologists, and Colleen was one of my colleagues who does that service. Insects. So we're going to talk about insects and we're going to talk about diseases. Insects, it's important to know that most damage to trees is either a result of the feeding on parts of the tree, the leaves or the stems or the trunk, or the eggs that may be laid in a protected zone on the leaf, the stem, or the trunk, that the offspring start feeding. They're immature. They start eating plant parts and destroying tissue that is important to sustain the life of the tree. Almost every species of tree has at least one insect pest that can cause significant problems. In the case of ash trees that Trent has mentioned, emerald ash borer is from Asia, and it's been imported to the United States. And all of our native ash from North America, white ash, single leaf ash, green ash, are vulnerable because our ash have not evolved to dissuade the predatory action of emerald ash borer. There's no defenses our trees have for this. So in some cases, a tree will have a specific catastrophic insect will cause its decline and death, perhaps. Now, trees contain a lot of insect biomass, life on themselves. Trees are full of insects. If you get out a hand lens and you look at the underside of a leaf, you'll see all sorts of interesting critters, and then you'll kind of scratch your head and you scratch your body because you were looking at these things and they kind of give you the itchies. And guess what? They jump off and they give you the itchies. And but most of those insects that are on those trees are actually beneficial, or they're causing no harm. There is a class of insects that we call native predatory insects, and they regulate the more destructive insects. So their job is to go and seek, kind of like a wolf seeking an elk, they'll go seek the destructive insect and consume it or overcome its defenses in some way. So there are many beneficial insects that reside on trees as well. It's just part of our living world. You see it's the same in soil. You'll see things living in soil and they're creepy crawly, but they're really important to be there. Insects diagnosis is a specialty, but you have access to a very good laboratory and a very good university, land-grant university, Utah State University in Logan, and they have two programs. One, they have an extension office specifically to serve Salt Lake County, and they not only diagnose trees, but shrubs, flowering plants, fruit orchard, orchard type trees. So you have a master gardener program. These are people that have taken on or maybe have a professional skill in plant diagnosis. And if you're concerned about that particular tree that's turning because its vegetation has changed and it seems abnormal in your mind's eye, you can have it diagnosed by a master gardener who's maybe seen many things coming to that office in Salt Lake County and can diagnose it in person, or you can send the laboratory, the specimen of the branch, the stem, the trunk to Utah State, and they will, for a fee, diagnose that. Now, I think they'll do one thing for free. I think if you were to contact them by email and send them a picture, both a picture of the tree at a distance, a picture of the tree kind of mid-range, I would say about 3 foot away, and then a close-up picture of what you're looking at is either an insect or a feeding pattern on a leaf, stem, or trunk, I think they'll give you for free that information and help you narrow down a diagnosis, or to give you a secondary opinion on maybe somebody who came out and looked at your tree and said, hey, do you think this is right? We do that in medicine. Hey, go get a second opinion, right? So that's a service that Utah State does through its biology department. And then I want to mention the Arborist for Hire listing on a website that we're affiliated with, Trent and I, professionally, the Utah Community Forest Council, and they're a chapter of the International Society of Arboriculture. So there are several places to get diagnosis. And you don't have to guess, and technology enables things to be done more rapidly through pictures and email. So there are some sources out there for you. I'm going to be talking specifically about 12 insect or diseases. On the right-hand side of the left-hand side of the screen are the insects, and on the right-hand side are the diseases that we frequently see here in Salt Lake County. Now, they don't always occur year after year after year. It's sometimes dictated by the climate, the weather pattern, the drought, the freeze-thaw cycle. It could be exacerbated by wind. And of course, all of these trees could be affected by soil. So soil is a very important element of tree support. And that's why Trent's discussion on tree selection is so important. You know, the alkalinity of the soil, the texture of the soil, the ability of the soil to hold moisture, how you're irrigating trees in conjunction with lawn and how it might be influencing, or fertilization. So some of these things that we'll talk about, or I'll mention in slides, may have relations with the abiotic, the non-living world, which is the mineral content in the soil, the irrigation water, the weather patterns. This is a really good pamphlet, and this is available online. I snipped slides from this pamphlet right here. You can see this for free if you're ever concerned about landscape tree health or landscape plant health. Most of its content deals with insects. Its second largest content is diseases. It goes into how do you deal with snails, how deer, weed plants that compete with trees or landscapes. So this is a super great publication. It's like 200 pages. And if you like to scroll through your smartphone or sit down on a Saturday morning and look at cool tree nerdy stuff like me, you know, this is a great resource. And it's updated, and again, it's a product of Utah State University Extension. So this is a slide that I borrowed, and this is a very significant driver of spruce tree health in northern Utah is this insect called spruce ips. It's a bark beetle. It's a very small bark beetle that chews its way into the bark of a spruce tree, usually smaller diameter tree trunks that don't have super thick bark yet. They chew their way in, and their intent is to lay. First, I think it's the female that bores in first. She sends out a pheromone, a chemical pheromone. It attracts a male. A male, they'll mate. They'll create a nuptial gallery where she lays her eggs. And then twice is potential that there could be two offsprings going through this process each growing year, and it can cause dramatic changes in the appearance of the top of the tree, which we call the crown. Let me see if I did this. So right here's the tree, the spruce crown. The thickness of the bark here at the top end is lesser than the thickness of the bark at the base. If water is lacking, it will be harder for the tree to conduct that moisture to the top of the tree by hydraulic pressure. So this may be in a water deficit to begin with. So this would be a stress factor. And then that particular insect is native, and it actually needs that host material, that spruce, white spruce, blue spruce, Black Hill spruce, to complete its life cycle. Its purpose is to propagate itself. So these are the little chewing larvae. And what they do is they create these tunnels, and they're essentially destroying the freeway or the highway network that allows water to go up from the roots to the tree branch tips. So this is how they're chewing. It's mostly the offspring that cause this, but blue spruce are particularly vulnerable. And the last two growing seasons in particular, previous to November of 2022, the last two growing seasons were very stressful for conifer trees because we lacked the snowfall. We didn't have the fall rains. So to circumvent this risk or this potential, heavy watering of spruce trees in late September, October, all the way November is a best practice to condition them so they will be more resistant, more sap in the tree, more water content in the tree, such they have the defense mechanism to push out these beetles as they're chewing. Plus, the trees will not emit a pheromone, a chemical signature into the neighborhood that says, I'm weak, I'm weak, I'm weak, come attack me. That's what these trees do. They send out chemical cues to insects that are in tune with these species of trees, and they invite attack. And this is something it was very common around the Olympics in the early mid-2000s because we had a drought. Remember the 2002, we're lacking snow. It occurred there, and it's occurring in the last 3 years quite prolifically in the Salt Lake County. So the way to overcome this is to water trees. That's the best thing, and Trent touched base on this. There's another Ips beetle, engraver beetle, bark beetle, that does the same thing, except it does it to pine trees. Austrian pine, Scotch pine, ponderosa pine, mugo pine. These would all be, again, hosts. And again, it's usually the top of the tree that these attack first, and then it progressively descends down. As these offspring come off the top, then they don't have to travel far. They'll travel to the mid portion and then attack and cause the death of that tissue, and they'll bring it right on down to the base until the whole tree is dead. There's no curative ways to swing a tree out of attack, but you can try to irrigate properly, and you can try not to disrupt the tree's root system by trenching, tunneling, restricting water to trees try to keep them healthy. Black pine leaf scale was mentioned by Trent, and this is very common in Salt Lake Valley. It's been going on since 2007. It's been a slow loss of an entire class of conifer evergreen trees, the pines. Scotch pine and Austrian pine being the most prolific ones we lose. And it's an interesting insect. It pierces the stem. It's a scale, so as a young insect is soft-bodied. It attaches itself to the stem, and then it grows this protective waxy shell over it. And so it's a hard body scale, and it does this on all of these leaves. And these leaves begin to appear this yellow or necrotic color. This tells us something looks abnormal. Now this insect is really hard to prevent. I think it's mostly a curative solution, and that's using a systemic insecticide. That's what I found to be the most successful. But there's controversy over that because there are a class of insecticides called neonicotinoids, and they can affect other insects in a negative way. Now, the great thing about using neonicotinoids, safari or dinotefuran, is that there aren't a lot of, I'm really sorry, I'm getting bad with that. They don't invite some of the pollinating insects like bees or flies that pollinate, and so hopefully we're not translating this chemical insecticide into the larger environment. And it's this is the time of year that you apply it. So it's very specific, and you'll probably want to read up on this one after you diagnosis and see if its solution is a curative and is very effective. Lilac ash borer was one of those insects that Trent mentioned affecting ash tree, and it bounces between two host species. Common lilac, which are used, I guess it's kind of like what do they call heirloom shrub, right? And old lilacs are pretty. They blossom this time of year. They're very hardy. They're very drought resistant. They do well in our soils. But they also host this insect, which is a clearwing moth. And the borer, like a bark beetle, chews into the trunk of the tree. And it creates this opening where decay will enter, and it becomes physically weak. The tree becomes so physically weak over time as it accumulates mass that, just like Trent mentioned with the flowering pear, it gets to a certain size where the wind, it just might catch just enough wind, that tree, that it can't physically hold itself up because it's had this previous boring or burrowing into the wood, and now there's a decay in that tree. So the way to overcome this, as prescribed, is to apply, if this is common, a permethrin on the tree trunk. It's a coating that you spray on the tree trunk, and it is to curtail the successful boring into the stem. I don't know if it kills the host that's trying to bore in, or if it's something that dissuades them. But it is effective to curtail this one with insecticides as a preventative treatment, not curative, but prevent damage to the tree. Another borer that we see common, and it kind of follows trends you see in species preference. There was a period of time in 2005 to 2015 where landscape architects and nursery were promoting the purple robe locust, which is a relative of the black locust tree. Well, unfortunately, this particular insect, the locust borer, really likes both black locust and purple robe locust in particular, and like a boring insect, it's that tissue damage. It's that mining or chewing by the offspring larvae that creates these wounds. And when we get enough snow that captures onto the branches of the trees or wind that forces them, these weak wooded areas break, and you have catastrophic tree failure. And once a tree trunk really breaks itself open by an event, it's an invitation for a lot of decay diseases to enter those tissues that otherwise would have been surrounded by bark and protected by a bark covering. So once you get disease, fungus disease into a tree, it may not be a goner soon, but it may be 3, 4, 5 years later that it's a goner because you have lost the protective barrier of bark, either through the boring of the insect or from the catastrophic failure of branches. That's a common one. Poplar borer is another borer that really prefers aspen and cottonwood trees. Now, I have aspen trees in my front yard in Centerville where I live, and each year I get a borer that wants to go and start chewing its way this time of year on the tree trunk. Sometimes I'll let it go, and sometimes I might be using a pyrethroid insecticide that you can obtain through the Home and Garden. Lowe's, Home Depot sell this type of product ready to use that are for tree borers, and you can spray it on the outside. I've done a lot of spraying in my career, so I know enough. I'm pretty confident in using it. The one thing I would tell you is use insecticides very sparingly, because it can affect those beneficial insects that are, again, hosted on the same tree. And I think there's a lot of scrutiny about the use of pesticides. There are probably, we gain a lot of benefits to it, but we need to be discriminate in how we apply them and for targeting the right host tree for the right host pest that's being the culprit. And we have to be judicious in trying to prevent tree stress in the first place, or we could live with the outcomes of it, and that's, in some cases, we just live with the outcomes, that there's borers in it, and this tree that may only live 25 to 40 years anyway is not going to live 100 years. A cottonwood and an aspen, they're just not going to live that long. Their lifespan is relatively short compared to other trees. So I let aspen suckers come up in my yard, and when this other tree that I failed to use an insecticide on dies or structurally fails, I cut it out, I use it for firewood, or Trent will make me a nice tie, and I let those suckers come up and replace it. That's how aspen grow. That's how they grow as a forest species. So poplar borer is a forest tree species, insect species, and they're affecting a forest tree, aspen, here in Utah. Okay, aphids. Aphids really don't destroy trees, but they're a nuisance. I grew up in St. George, and we had a pecan tree in the front yard, and we'd park cars out in the driveway, and there'd be these little spots, and it was the honeydew that the aphids were emitting out of their digestive system, another word for it, I won't say it, falling on the car. It was a nuisance. But the tree lived through it. These are mostly, as it suggests here, little negative effect on tree health. It can be tolerated as a pest. But if it really bugs you, I didn't mean that as a pun, but you can use insecticidal soaps which are less impactful to the environment you can use, but I don't recommend systemic insecticides for aphids. I just generally tolerate them. Yes?
I've seen buying ladybugs as a recommendation for getting rid of aphids. Is that not recommended?
Which one is that?
Ladybugs.
Ladybugs. Yeah, ladybugs. Yep. There are some native species of ladybugs and non-native. And ladybugs, you release them, and they naturally migrate from the east to the west here in the northern hemisphere. So you can use, I would say, dump the ladybugs 2 houses up the street to the east. Let them get started, and let them be good and hungry by the time they get to your house. But yes, that's one of those predatory beneficial insects that curtail aphids and other small soft-body insects.
So if you find a tree full of ladybugs, does that mean the tree's got bad bugs?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Ladybug populations rise and fall like any other things, but they might be actively feeding, and there might be, replicating themselves. So, yeah, let's save the ladybugs. You don't have to spray. If you see ladybugs, probably not spray, because they're probably doing something very beneficial that you can't see, because they're small and they're eating smaller stuff. Little offspring that the human eye can't see. But yeah, I think that leave our ladybugs alone. They collect them and bring them to your yard if you see somewhere else. Honey locust spider mite is a very small insect, like an aphid. An aphid's, let me go back, is 1/8 of an inch long. A honey locust spider mite is 1/80th of an inch long. Really super small. And I only bring this up because honey locust is a very hardy recommended tree for Salt Lake County. And there is a time of the year, should I go, that these are prolific, and it's usually during the heat. And usually trees are close to the street that have a lot of radiant heat coming up at night suffer from this, and there'll be this coloration change right here that will be the indicator there's something going on. I'm going to go through these really fast, the diseases, because they're more complicated and I don't know them as well. Powdery mildew affects families of the rose species. And we see them on apple trees, crab apples. So picking out of powdery mildew resistant crab apple is a good thing. Anthracnose is a fungal disease that we see on London plane tree, on sycamore, maple, and oak, and it's exacerbated when we have a wet, dark, cloudy spring with lots of rainfall. We could have it this year if we get another rainstorm. Even though we're hitting the 70s and 80s, it's those frequent spring rain showers that exacerbate this, and it causes lesions on the tree trunk, and then it causes this discoloration of the leaves, and then this vigorous growth of smaller branches from larger branches. And you cannot cure this. You can use a preventative fungicide, but really it's not, the trees usually live, though they look really bad. They usually live through anthracnose. Fire blight is one that affects flowering pear. It's a bacterium disease, so antibiotics can be used to do this. One of the best things is to prune out parts of the tree that are affected and discarded that plant material and disinfect the pruning shears between operations and to curtail its spread. And again, fire blight is probably one of those spring deals where common rain showers, cloudy weather, but also irrigation can exacerbate this, sprinkler irrigation. Leaf spots are very common on all trees. It's a fungal that grows and creates a dark necrotic area on the leaf. They don't kill trees. They're unsightly and they look like they're sickly plants, but they usually grow themselves through it. And that's very common in aspen as well. And then finally, this disease right here called slime flux is very prolific in Siberian elm trees, old elm trees that have volunteered or may grow from planting a long time ago, but also cottonwoods. It creates this area where it's wet, wetwood, bacterial wetwood, and it smells and stinks. In some cases, it can lead to the destruction of inner heartwood, which can affect the structural stability of the tree. But usually we just get along with it, even though it's unsightly. Okay, this is the, if you're seeking arborists who could help you diagnose trees or do the pesticide applications or do the prunings or give you advice for fee, the Utah Community Forest Council website has the Arborist for Hire toggle, and you'll find it here. They are listed in there. Be a wise consumer. Get references and have them show their proof of insurance before they do any work on your lot. And I just want to thank you very much and thank Herriman for supporting tree endeavors and establishing trees where we live, work, and play. Herriman City's been recognized for 15 consecutive years as Tree City USA by the Arbor Day Foundation. And of course, Anthony, if you're here, and all the department officials, elected officials for supporting the planting of trees and park strips and parks and cemeteries and trails. Trent, my colleague here, last year, 22 Arborist of the Year for the state of Utah, really competent professional, a good resource, and a very wise public servant. I've worked with Trent for many years. And then most of you who have an interest in planting trees on your lawns, and you can have selfish interest for planting trees. Just try not to plant them next to the fence, the property line. Plant them so you can get some shade out of them. Plant diverse species of trees. Learn about your trees, nerd out on it, and everything starts small. So these little small trees grow up to be massive organisms that we admire and celebrate. And I think Herriman's on the way to creating a tree canopy. And it's you, the property owners, that make this possible. So I compliment you. I think we're wrapping it up as far as timing goes. If you had any questions, what should we do, Jonathan, on the questions? Should we take them now or should we wrap it?
Yeah, no, if folks have got questions, and I'll bring a microphone around if you...
Okay. So Trent, come up here if you, are there any questions?
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry I went through it fast. I don't know. I didn't rehearse this. Yes?
Is there a minimum distance that you should plant a tree from the next one?
Okay, this is what I recommend on sidewalks. 6 feet from the sidewalk, on the house side, okay? If it's going to be a large diameter, long-lived tree, they'll get 100 years old. I like 6 feet. And the reason why is sometimes we have to do things in our sidewalk. We salt them, we move the snow off, the kids are, jump roping and slapping trees. So I think that on the fence too. We weed eat our fences to keep the grasses and the weeds down. And fences make good neighbors. Trees on the fence line don't make good neighbors. So they kind of conflict. And if you own the tree trunk 100% on your side of the lot, you own the tree. If you plant it on that property line and it grows into the adjacent neighbor's lot, they are a co-owner legally of that tree. And you have basically given up your right controlling interest of that tree. And sometimes there's conflicts. People get upset with your trees are dropping leaves, they're dropping fruit. That's a hazard branch. So I like at least 6 feet from the property line. Yeah. Yes?
Does that count for branches too? If the branches go over the fence line or just the...
Yeah, the branches, the vertical plane of the property line invites the person who's the branch, so Trent's the trunk, okay, on his deal. And this is the property line right here where this seam is. As the adjacent neighbor, you can prune up to the vertical property line. But you should avoid doing anything to that tree that would cause its decline or death. So the pruning back, you need to come to agreement on where the pruning cuts. And just doing them in a vertical line can raise issues for the health of that tree because those spores get in there and you'll have branch dieback to the node or where the branch bisects. And that's another reason, maybe 6 foot's a minimum, but maybe 12, 15 feet in buys you the controlling interest of that tree forever and more.
We were the neighbor, our neighbors cut them off the fence line. Quite so.
It's unsightly. They don't look natural, do they?
Well, I can't see the back part. But
Yeah.
Tree balance itself.
it's still fine. They're still pretty big, but it's the problem. One of them is like 3 different maples, and one of them got some winter kill, so it was a little sadder than the other two. And I said, don't chop that one, and they chopped it anyway.
How easy is it to transplant a tree that's on a property line, you want to move it away from it?
It's very easy to do if they've only been in the ground 1 or 2 growing seasons. But a well-established tree that's been in there a decade, I would say the probability of successfully transplanting that is minimal, like single percentage, and it's going to cost you a lot of time, muscle, backache, and the success won't be there. And it's unfortunately, if we were Bill Gates and we had a lot of money, he can afford to hire a crane and a crew and to box and shore up the tree for a week and then move it. But we don't, it's hard. Yeah. The other thing of trees when you plant them grow really slow the first 2 years. And then they start taking off about the 3rd year when they get those roots under them. So that's why I recommend the first 2 years as possible to transplant them. But as they get those roots established, they've become dependent upon the water and the stability and the dissolved minerals that they uptake to supply the trunk and the leaves. And you're setting that tree into a deficit by such a radical transplant.
The other thing too is ideally for every 1 inch of trunk diameter, you need 1 foot of root ball. So if you've got a tree that's, 12 inches of trunk diameter, you've got to get a 12-foot root ball. And that's challenging to move.
Is it possible to get a spar off of it, or branch or something?
It depends on the species. Some species produce really readily by, sticking a branch in the ground, some not so much. Your conifers, most of those, I can't think of any conifers that will do that. Willows, poplars, cottonwoods, they do really well sticking a branch in the ground, but most of those aren't going to be your ideal yard trees.
I have a question. We're looking at, the reason we came here is we wanted to see what kind of trees would be most ideal. So our backyard's pretty bare, and we're looking at trees going to different nurseries and stuff, and we saw a couple that we liked that we wanted to purchase, but we didn't see them on the list, and so I wanted to kind of bounce them off of you.
Sure.
If it's something that, if it's not on the list for a reason, or we should just stay away from them. But
Sure, and there are a lot of trees that are not on the list simply because we haven't tried them, and I'm always open to try. In fact, I love trying something new, but there are a lot of trees that aren't on the list for a reason. So what are you looking at?
So a couple that we were thinking of, one was a magnolia tree, which we really thought was pretty, and then also we like Japanese maples. I like maples in general.
Sure.
Japanese maples, but I know that they're very kind of delicate.
Yeah, they really struggle. Occasionally you'll see one doing well, but they really struggle here, the Japanese maples. I've only seen a couple of magnolias planted here in the city. I know there's one in Rosecrest Park, if you're familiar with it. I don't know how long it's been there, but it's about this tall, and it's really a bush, not really a tree. Yeah, so I have seen a couple in people's yards that are well-maintained, well-watered, and taken care of. I would say look carefully there are several magnolia varieties that you can pick up. So look at the variety, see what the cold hardiness zone is. Usually there's a little tag on the tree that'll tell you cold hardiness zone. Make sure that you're at least a 6, preferably a 5 if you can find it. But I know there are some that can do well here. It's not one that we've done a lot with. So, but the Japanese maple, I personally would probably steer clear of.
So on selecting trees, it's always fun to go out and look at the arboretums, the demonstration gardens in Utah. The Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District has a demonstration. Thanksgiving Point in Utah County, University of Utah has Red Butte Garden. There's one in Davis County at the Kaysville Extension. So, and the campuses, they have some great tree specimens, and sometimes you can find maps of the tree campuses, but to find trees that you want to fall in love with because you just fell in love with it, right? Because you like the look of appearance and what it contributes to landscape, visit the arboretums. And a lot of arboretums are using less diverse, underutilized species, and they've been for about 10 years. So if they're not on the list now, they could be 10 years from now because they're proving their performing ability at the arboretum. But if you want to get a jump start on it, and you don't want to just rely on digital technology for tree selection, make a fun trip going to arboretums where they either virtual map or the map or signs on the trees and shrubs, and there's probably little tidbits, that information that can offer you on tree selection.
And if you find something new and unique and it's working well, call me, tell me about it, because we'll get it put on the list if it's doing good.
You were talking earlier about the quality of water. I live in an area where we landscape using secondary water. Do you have any comments about that?
I'm sorry. Our secondary water is primarily Utah lake water, so it's Jordan River, Utah Lake. It has a real high salinity content, so there's a lot of salt in that water. So you just have to make sure that you're looking for species that are going to tolerate that salt content. And most of the species that we've got on our preferred or on our approved list are going to do okay with that salt content. There are a few that I think I have a hop hornbeam on there listed because it grows native in North Dakota and I love it, and I was really excited to find a few of them, and I've tried them. I'm still up in the air on that one, but most of the ones that are on there are going to do okay with your secondary water.
The same thing would transfer to shrubs in that, I imagine, as well.
Yeah, look for something that's salt tolerant.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
So that's where the conservation garden at South Valley, they are dealing with some of the same secondary water systems, right? Canal water. They might have some stuff to give you, some information, because everybody's kind of having to face lower quality waters for irrigational landscapes because our better waters are reserved for drinking consumption, industrial uses. So
it's going to get worse.
It's going to get worse, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when a pine beetle or maybe boring insects go into the tree, if you catch it soon enough, can the tree heal itself from the structural damage that they do? Right? You got little tunnels going through the tree. If you catch it so the tree's not dead, will the tree eventually fill in the tunnels or reestablish new highways?
Yeah. There's pitch mass borers affects pine trees, and it's just like an isolated target that it attacks, and it creates all this pitch, this waxy pitch, pine gum that comes out. So that's just very specific that will not destroy the tree. It may curtail the structural stability of the wood engineering, but it won't cause death. And spruce ips can establish what's called a strip attack on a certain side of the tree, or just the top, the very tip top. But sometimes if the population of Ips beetle crashes, or if you intervene with insecticidal treatment and that tree is no longer the host, some of the top branches can assume a vertical growth and become the new parent or the stem. Now the tree is going to look kind of funny because it's not a central leader that Trent mentioned, the trunk all the way up to the top. It's going to have a hui in there or a fork, but trees can make it through modest light attacks. But you kind of got to be, timing's everything on treatments and identifying it too.
And also the tree's natural defense, and Scott talked about that in his presentation. If you give that tree plenty of water, and if that tree is healthy and it's got lots of water, when that beetle bores in, that tree is going to just pitch it right out, and it'll just punch it right out of that hole and get stuck in that pitch. So if the tree is healthy and the attack is limited, it's going to be able to survive that.
Once they destroy the structural portions of the tree can't recover. They won't rebuild the structure.
No.
Trees, humans, we grow tissue over wounds. trees compartmentalize or wall it off, so there'll never be a resumption of live tissue, but there'll be adjacent tissue that's still living that will try to mitigate the loss of certain tree tissues. But you can't, they don't cure themselves. They just wall off the attack zone and try to make it a year or two more. But they don't heal like us. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
I was late, so I don't know if this was covered, but what is the best way to get a soil test?
So Utah State University actually does soil testing, and if I usually have to Google it. I just Google soil test Utah State University. They have a set of requirements that they're looking for. Typically, they're going to want you to take, a sample from 4 or 5 different places within the yard if you can get it. But and they'll tell you about how much. But just dig up a little bit, and they'll tell you how deep they want you to go. Put it in a plastic bag. Send it to Utah State. Depending on the test you want them to do, it's about $60 for just a really basic test, and they'll tell you kind of what the nutrients are in the soil, a little bit about the soil breakdown. If you want a more specific test, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's like $80 to get more detail out of that test. But you dig it up, put it in a bag, send it to Utah State. But look at their website first, because it'll tell you specifically what they're looking for, how deep to go and all that kind of stuff. I've only sent in one soil sample, and that's been some time ago, so I can't remember, but good question. No, I generally don't. I have a pretty good idea of what we're dealing with here.
The color of the soil around these parts, if it's really light colored and very fine in texture, it's alkaline soil, and we have to select trees that are tolerant of alkalinity. Specifically, how the chemical bonds in alkaline soil bind micronutrients, iron, manganese, and in some cases, nitrogen can be curtailed, right?
In some cases, I think, yeah.
So soil pH is like a really big determining outcome of a soil test, and texture. And if you know those 2 key features, you can use the tree browser, and you can list strongly alkaline, modestly alkaline, neutral in your query for finding tree species. And in the query, what it computer kicks out is based upon some of the features in the soil test. Its texture, its alkalinity. So those 2 features are probably worth the money.
For sure.
Yeah. And Trent probably could tell you what neighborhood you live in, and probably knows the park strips well enough.
To some extent, yeah. So, and I am a resource. If you have questions, I can always come out and take a look. I can't operate as an arborist on private property here, because that's a conflict of interest as a city employee. But if you just want an opinion, I can always come out and just take a look, and we can chat a little bit.
Yeah, I might need you to come out.
Okay.
I got a couple of mature fruit trees that are a little out of control.
Sure. And so, if there's work that needs to be done, I would have to refer you back to that list Scott put up there from the Community Forestry Council. I am on that list, but I can't operate privately here in Herriman, so.
A good rule of thumb for pruning.
Yeah, and in fact, if I was I wanted to see what kind of a turnout we had here tonight. I'm actually thinking about putting on a pruning workshop similar to this in the fall. So if there's enough interest in that, I would certainly consider doing a pruning workshop. So. Yes.
So that reminded me, you may have already said this, but when is the best time of year to plant?
To plant trees?
To plant trees.
So our city policy is from September 1st to June 1st. So really, you can plant trees any time of year. I like to avoid the hottest time of year, because that's when the tree is going to be stressed the most. So the unfortunate thing is that's when all the trees are available from the nurseries, is during the hottest time of the year. As long as you're watering it regularly and keeping it, you want to make sure that you're not going to dry out the roots from the time you get it to the nursery to the time you get it home, so you want to plant it fairly quickly. I much prefer planting this time of year, early spring and later in the fall. I can't remember which city it is, but they do all of their planting in the winter. The only thing I don't like about planting in the winter is you got to deal with the frozen soil, and it's hard to get it back on the roots without. So I don't know what they do. They've got some system, but they're fairly successful. But I try to avoid the hot times of the year. Oh, yes.
So you mentioned that trying to change soil characteristics is a Band-Aid. Is that true for salinity? Isn't it true that you can leach salinity out of the soil?
You can leach salinity out of the soil. pH is not something you'll have much success trying to change. I think you can do some work with salinity. Thank you. Thank you for coming. So, I haven't really done much with that. I couldn't give you any real guidance on that or any rule of thumb, but I believe that you can leach salinity out of your soil. The problem is the water we're using is saline as well, so every time you water your tree, you're just putting it right back in. So if you're using the secondary water. Culinary, not so much, but. All right.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. We really appreciate you being here. Oh, one more question?
So I had a 4-year-old Bosnian pine that my landscaper put in that just was beautiful. And last year, within 5-7 days, I browned. It was a beautiful green tree. 7 days, so I went camping, came back 7 days. Totally brown.
And so it had been in the ground for 4 years? Yes. Interesting.
Walking along like something going on in the corner, a board or something.
Sabotage.
Trees can suffer from volatilized herbicides like lawn weed killer that's put on in excess of 90 temperatures, and they can migrate into a landscape. Usually it's whole landscape destruction, not just an isolated specimen. And that's a great tree, by the way, Boston pine. Sometimes it's sudden hydraulics collapse where it's, and probably not your case because you probably irrigated, right? Mm-hmm. If you irrigate your lawn, you're not going to suffer that.
This wasn't in the lawn, it was just, I had a drip system going through it. The only thing we did was we pruned off some of the lower branches. But it was just beautiful tree. Yeah. We wanted to plant another one, but I'm scared.
Yeah. So there are some trees that are subject to air pollution too.
And gophers.
What's that?
Gophers.
Gophers could be a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have, I know that's something that we battle constantly in the parks is gophers. So, I mean, and if that's the case, it could be, I mean, most any species could be subject to that, so. But I will, yeah. I will tell you, we planted a number of Bosnian pines, and they seem to be doing pretty well in the parks, so.
That's why they planted them.
Yeah.
Because he said that was probably his favorite.
Yeah. The only thing I don't like about Bosnian pine is it doesn't get very big. I typically am looking for bigger trees, but was there one more question?
You identified a tree in the park near my house. It was a twin-needle juniper.
Uh-huh.
And I know there are quite a few in the city parks. I cannot find them.
Twin needle, I'm thinking would be a pinyon pine.
Oh, maybe it's pinyon.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. So there are a number of pinions scattered around. Which park is by your house? Emmeline. Okay. Oh, yeah. Yep, I know the one you're talking about. Yep.
And I know there's some in the park by the city cemetery, but I just can't find any online or in nurseries.
They are hard to find, and I live in Tooele, and I do some side work out there. I just bought 8 of them from Progressive Plants, but they were the ball and burlap. In fact, that was the picture I used up there, were pinyon pine. They're a little bit hard to come by, and the reason for that is most of the trees that we buy here are brought in from Oregon, but it's too wet in Oregon to grow pinyon, so they grow them in Colorado, and Colorado is not treating for Japanese beetle, and so that's limited the trees that we can get brought in from Colorado because they have made a decision not to treat for Japanese beetle, and so that limits the pinyon we can get brought into the state. So the larger ones, the nurseries will spray them because they know that they can sell those big ones and still make money. Smaller ones, it's harder for them to make money on, and so we're not seeing small ones right now. I knew this fellow in Stockton wanted pinyon, and I've been calling around nurseries for about 1.5 years trying to find them. So it's a tough one to get a hold of.
Isn't that pine nuts?
Yeah, that's where the pine nuts come from. Yep. The one by your house does. A lot of them don't. A lot of them are just kind of formless like junipers, but that one by your house is beautiful. Well, thanks everybody. I appreciate you being here tonight. And I want to thank Scott too. Scott's a wealth of knowledge and information. He's the guy I call when I have problems or questions. So.